Imagine spending weeks hunting a serial killer, only to realize that the person you are chasing may understand you better than you understand yourself. That is exactly where Alice Black finds herself in Furious. Because Catherine Grace is not a typical killer. She doesn't simply choose random victims. She studies people. She watches them. She gets close to them. And then, when they least expect it, she turns their own secrets against them. But there is something even more disturbing about Catherine. She believes that the people she targets deserve what is coming. And that is what makes this case so dangerous. Because Alice is not simply trying to catch a murderer. She is trying to understand why these murders are happening in the first place. Welcome back to the world of Furious, the psychological crime thriller starring Emmy Rossum as FBI agent Alice Black and Lola Pettigrew as Catherine. And if you've been following the series, you already know that this isn't just a simple police versus killer story. The deeper Alice digs, the more complicated the case becomes. Will Alice catch Catherine? The real question is, what happens when Alice finally gets close enough to understand her? Because throughout this story, Alice and Catherine have been moving toward each other. One woman represents the law, the other has decided that the law isn't enough, and both believe they are pursuing justice. That is where the story becomes truly uncomfortable. Alice has evidence. Catherine has anger. Alice follows procedure. Catherine follows her own moral code. But both women have been shaped by violence. And that means the further Alice goes into Catherine's world, the more difficult it becomes to keep emotional distance. That is one of the central ideas behind Furious. The series isn't asking us to decide whether Catherine is simply good or evil. Instead, it asks a much harder question. What happens when someone who has suffered injustice decides to become the judge, jury, and executioner? And more importantly, what happens when the person trying to stop her begins to understand why she did it? That is the emotional trap waiting for Alice, and Catherine knows it. She doesn't need to overpower Alice physically. She only needs Alice to start questioning the system she represents. Because once Alice begins wondering whether the system failed Catherine's victims, the investigation changes completely. And that's where episode 6 could take us. The hunter and the hunted are no longer moving on separate paths. Their paths are beginning to merge. At first glance, she looks like the obvious villain. She deceives people. She enters their lives. She creates relationships. And eventually, those relationships become deadly. But Catherine's targets are not chosen randomly. The larger story suggests that her killings are connected to people who have escaped meaningful consequences for what they have done. That makes her campaign much more complicated. Because Catherine isn't killing simply because she enjoys killing. She believes she is correcting something, and that belief is what makes her terrifying. A normal criminal might run from the police. Catherine does something different. She studies the police, she studies her victims, and she studies the weaknesses in the system around them. That is why Alice has such a difficult job. Every time Alice follows a clue, Catherine may already be thinking several moves ahead. And remember what happened earlier in the season. Catherine repeatedly changed identities. She disappeared into other lives. She created new versions of herself. And each time Alice got closer, Catherine became harder to recognize. This is more than a disguise. It is Catherine's entire philosophy. She believes identity is something you can construct. If one version of yourself becomes dangerous, you simply become someone else. But Alice doesn't have that luxury. Alice is an FBI agent. Her identity is tied to the institution. Her badge matters. Her history matters. Her mistakes matter. And that creates a fascinating contrast. Catherine can disappear. Alice cannot. Catherine can reinvent herself. Alice has to answer for everything she does. And as the investigation becomes more personal, that difference becomes increasingly important. Now let's talk about Alice. Alice isn't chasing Catherine simply because she wants another arrest. She is clearly emotionally invested in the case. The investigation has begun touching parts of Alice's own life and history. That is why Catherine represents more than just another suspect. Catherine becomes a mirror, a distorted mirror. Alice sees someone who believes the official system is incapable of delivering justice. And even if Alice rejects Catherine's methods, she cannot simply ignore the question behind them. What if Catherine is exposing crimes that powerful people wanted buried? That question is dangerous, because Alice's job is to arrest Catherine. But if Catherine's targets really are connected to something larger, then catching Catherine may not solve the problem. It might actually allow the people behind the problem to escape. And this is where episode 6 could become explosive, because the story has repeatedly suggested that the murders are connected to something larger than one woman's revenge. The case is becoming a network, and Alice is getting closer to its center. But Catherine may also be getting closer to Alice, and that creates the possibility of a confrontation that is not simply physical. Imagine Alice finally sitting across from Catherine. No chase, no disguises, no weapons, just two women looking at each other.
Alice asks Catherine why she did it, and Catherine doesn't deny anything. Instead, she asks Alice a question. If the law had protected them, would I have needed to? That question would strike directly at the heart of the series, because Alice could arrest Catherine, but she cannot arrest the question, and that is Catherine's greatest weapon. She can force Alice to look at the failures behind the crimes. She can make Alice doubt whether justice and legality are always the same thing. But here's the important distinction. Understanding Catherine does not mean forgiving her, and that is where Furious becomes more complicated than a conventional serial killer thriller. Catherine may have reasons. She may have suffered. She may have discovered terrible things, but she is still making deliberate choices, and Alice has to decide where understanding ends and accountability begins. No one expected the investigation to become this personal, and now the danger is not just that Catherine might kill again. The danger is that Alice might become emotionally trapped inside Catherine's world, and once that happens, the difference between hunter and hunted becomes almost impossible to see.
Now we reach the most interesting part of the story. Because if you have been watching carefully, Catherine is not the only mystery. Alice is a mystery too. Why is she so determined to solve this case? Why does Catherine's story affect her so deeply? And why does Alice continue pushing forward, even when the investigation begins taking a personal toll? Those questions matter because the series has repeatedly connected the investigation to Alice's own history. Episode 3, for example, explicitly forces Alice to confront painful memories from her past. That isn't just character development, it's a warning. The case is changing Alice, and Catherine may be the person who understands that transformation better than anyone. Think about the psychological chess game. Catherine wants Alice to see the world through her eyes. Alice wants Catherine to see the world through the law. Both women are trying to change the other, and whichever woman succeeds first gains the advantage. That's why the biggest twist may not be a surprise murder. It may be a revelation. A revelation about what Alice has been investigating all along. Because the deeper the case goes, the less it looks like a collection of unrelated crimes. The victims may have connections. The powerful people surrounding them may have connections. And Catherine may know much more than she has revealed. That creates an enormous problem for Alice, because if Catherine possesses information that could expose a larger network, then arresting her immediately might actually destroy the evidence Alice needs. But waiting gives Catherine more time, and every extra minute could mean another victim. It's a perfect trap. Arrest Catherine, and risk losing the bigger case. Follow the bigger case, and risk another murder. This is where Alice's decisions become critical, and it's also where Danny becomes important. Danny has been part of Alice's investigation, and the partnership provides another perspective on what is happening. Because when someone becomes obsessed with a case, they often stop seeing what everyone else sees. A partner can become the voice saying, "Stop, look again." But will Alice listen? That's the question. Because Catherine has already become more than a suspect. She has become an obsession. And obsession is exactly what Catherine understands. She uses intimacy as a weapon. She gets close to people. She learns what they want. She learns what they fear. Then she uses that information against them. Alice's vulnerability is different. Alice wants answers, and that makes her predictable. Give Alice another unanswered question, and she will follow it. Give her a hidden connection, and she will investigate it. Give her one missing piece, and she will risk everything to find it. Catherine understands this. So what happens if Catherine deliberately leaves Alice a clue? Not enough to solve the case, just enough to keep Alice moving. That would turn the investigation into a game. Alice thinks she is hunting Catherine, but Catherine may actually be controlling the direction of the hunt. And that's where the title Furious becomes especially meaningful. The anger driving Catherine isn't just personal. It's contagious. It spreads. It affects Alice. It affects the people around them. And eventually it threatens to consume everyone involved. Now imagine the final stretch of episode 6. Alice gets a breakthrough. For the first time, she has something that could finally connect Catherine to the larger conspiracy. She thinks she has won. But then she discovers something that changes the entire meaning of the evidence. The person she thought was being hunted may actually have been waiting for her. The person she thought was hiding may have deliberately brought her closer. And suddenly Alice has to ask herself, who is really setting the trap? That is the kind of twist that fits the psychological structure of the series. Because Catherine doesn't need to beat Alice in a traditional confrontation. She only needs Alice to make one mistake. One emotional mistake. One procedural mistake. One decision made because Alice believes she is doing the right thing. And if that happens, Catherine wins. At least for the moment. But there is another possibility. Alice could finally understand Catherine's pattern. And if Alice does, then Catherine may have nowhere left to hide. That would set up the most dangerous confrontation of the season. Not because Alice finally knows where Catherine is, but because Catherine may finally realize that Alice knows who she really is. And when that happens, there will be nowhere left for either woman to run. So where does that leave us? At the moment, the exact ending of episode 6 cannot be responsibly revealed, because the episode is scheduled to premiere on August 17, 2026, and detailed official plot information has not yet been published. Current episode listings identify it simply as episode 6. But we can understand exactly what the episode needs to accomplish. Alice and Catherine have reached a turning point. The early episodes established the mystery. The middle of the season expanded the investigation. Now the story needs to bring those threads together. Alice needs to get closer to the truth. Catherine needs to become more exposed. And the larger conspiracy needs to become impossible to ignore. But there is something even more important. Alice has to decide what kind of person she wants to be. Because Catherine's entire philosophy is built around one belief. Justice that arrives too late is not justice. Alice cannot accept Catherine's methods, but she also cannot ignore the failures that helped create Catherine's rage. And that is the moral battle at the center of the series. Catherine believes violence can create injustice. Alice believes the law can. The terrifying possibility is that both women may discover that neither answer is enough. That is why their relationship is so fascinating. They are not simple opposites. They are two different responses to the same broken world. One chooses revenge. The other chooses investigation. One operates outside the system. The other works inside it. But both want something similar. They want the truth to matter. And as the season moves towards its final episodes, the question becomes, how much is Alice willing to sacrifice to uncover that truth? Because Catherine has already crossed that line. She has sacrificed her identity, her safety, her relationships, and ultimately her humanity. Alice still has a choice. But the longer she follows Catherine, the harder that choice becomes. And that's why episode 6 could be one of the most important chapters of the entire season. It isn't simply another episode in the investigation. It's the point where the emotional consequences of the case begin catching up with everyone. Catherine is running out of places to hide. Alice is running out of emotional distance. And the people connected to the larger conspiracy may finally realize that someone is coming for them. But there is one final question. What if Catherine isn't the final enemy? What if she's only the person exposing something much bigger? What if Alice finally catches her, only to discover that Catherine was never the end of the story? That possibility would completely change the meaning of everything we've watched so far. Because then the real mystery isn't, who is Catherine Grace? It's, what created Catherine Grace? And if Alice discovers the answer, she may have to decide whether bringing Catherine to justice is enough, or whether she needs to expose the people who made Catherine believe that justice would never come. That is the question that makes Furious more than a simple serial killer thriller. It's a story about anger. It's a story about trauma. It's a story about justice. And most importantly, it's about what happens when people lose faith that the system will protect them. Catherine chose her own form of justice. Alice is still trying to believe in the official version. Sooner or later, those two beliefs are going to collide. And when they do, someone is going to break. So if you're watching episode 6, keep your eyes on 3 things. First, Catherine's next identity. Second, Alice's emotional reaction to the case. And third, the connections between Catherine's victims. Because those 3 pieces could reveal where the story is really going. And remember, the closer Alice gets to Catherine, the closer she may also get to the truth about herself. That is what makes this chase so dangerous. Because in the end, Alice may catch Catherine, but she may also discover that catching the killer was never the hardest part. The hardest part was understanding why she was so determined to catch her in the first place. And that is where the real story of Furious begins.